Welcome, traveler. Tonight we step back through time, into the stone walls of a lonely castle where shadows whisper and kings come and go. You're safe now. Let your thoughts slow down. Before we begin, I gently invite you to like this video. It helps others find their way here too. And if you'd like, tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It's always a quiet joy to see where sleep finds its way. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the story begin. The castle loomed above the fields like a sleeping beast. Its stone walls, gray and ancient, rose from the earth like a memory that refused to fade. Cold winds slipped through the narrow cracks, and the heavy wooden gate creaked whenever the guards opened it. This was not a place of comfort. It was a place of duty, of power, and sometimes fear. But to a small barefoot boy named Adric, it was simply home. Adric had been born somewhere beyond the hills, though he did not know exactly where. His earliest memory was of his mother's worn hands placing a piece of bread in his tiny fingers and saying goodbye as a man with a cloak led him away. He must have been 5, or perhaps 6. He could not remember her face anymore, only that she had a kind voice and that her hands smelled faintly of onions. The castle took him in, not with love, but with rules. The steward gave him a thin blanket and showed him a straw mat in the corner of the servant ass quarters. From that moment, Eadric belonged to the stone corridors, the dust, and the chores. Each morning began before the sun had stretched over the trees. He woke in the dark to the bell in the yard, rubbing sleep from his eyes and pulling on a coarse linen shirt that always itched. The floor was cold under his feet. There were no shoes for the lowest boys. Only when you proved useful could you earn that luxury. Adric's task was simple, but endless. He swept the kitchens, carried heavy baskets of turnips from the cellars, and scrubbed soot from the fireplaces until his arms ached. Sometimes he was sent to the upper halls to polish floors so smooth they shone like still water, but he was not allowed to speak there, not even a whisper. That part of the castle belonged to the nobles. And nobles, they said, did not like the sound of servants. But Adric listened, and he remembered. He watched the knights with wide eyes as they walked by in their heavy armor, clinking like coins in a pouch. He watched the lady of the castle, her dresses long and flowing, her hair braided like ropes of gold. He watched the steward, who always frowned, and the cook, who always shouted, but slipped Adric extra bits of meat when no one was looking. And sometimes, late at night, when the halls were quiet and the fire in the great hearth burned low, Adric would creep near the stone pillars and stare up at the paintings of old kings that lined the walls. One king had fierce eyes and held a sword high. Another sat calmly with a hawk on his wrist. Adric didn't know their names, but he imagined their lives. He wondered if any of them had started with bare feet and onion-scented memories. Life in the castle was never still for long. One season bled into the next. The fields outside changed colors from green to gold to white. Lords arrived with their hunting dogs. Messengers brought scrolls sealed with wax. Sometimes the church bells rang all night, and people whispered of war, though Adric never understood who fought or why. He grew, inch by inch, year by year. His hands became rough. His back bent from lifting, his fingers calloused from scrubbing. But he never complained. There was no one to complain to, and no time for dreaming. And yet sometimes when he sat by the hearth at night, too tired to sleep, he would imagine. What if he had been born a knight, or a prince? What if he had his own horse, his own sword? Would the lady of the castle nod to him then? Would the steward smile? Would anyone remember his name? But morning always came, and with it, the bell. And with the bell, more work. One winter, when the snow piled high against the castle walls and the fires burned low to save wood, Eadric fell sick. His chest hurt when he coughed, and his body shook with chills. He tried to keep working, but he staggered in the kitchens and dropped a bowl. The cook shouted, and Adric's knees gave out. That was when the steward noticed. He was not thrown out, as he feared. Instead, he was given broth and a warmer blanket. It was the first time anyone had shown him a sliver of mercy. He slept for days, drifting in and out of dreams. And in those dreams, he saw the stone walls crumble, the kings step down from their portraits, and the servants rise up like waves from the sea. When he woke, he was still Adric, still barefoot, still tired, but something had changed. People looked at him with something new, not warmth exactly, but recognition. He had survived. He had endured. From that day forward they gave him better tasks. He was sent to assist the armorer, polishing chainmail and sharpening blades. He was allowed in the stables where he brushed horses and learned their moods. And once, just once, he was trusted to light the torches in the hall where the lords dined. He walked with quiet pride that night, flame in hand, lighting each torch as he had been taught. He did not speak, but he listened, and he remembered. He was still a servant, still a boy. But he had learned the castle's heartbeat, its rhythms, its secrets, and one day, though he didn't yet know it, he would watch it all change. He would see kings fall. But for now, Adric simply returned to his mat, pulled the blanket to his chin, and let the cold stone floor cradle him into sleep. By the time Adric was old enough to lift a bucket with one hand, he had learned that the castle spoke in sounds, soft, creeping ones that most ignored. The great bells tolled for prayer and danger, but it was the quiet noises that told Adric everything he needed to know. Footsteps meant more than just movement. The clatter of armored boots was not the same as the soft shuffle of velvet slippers. The cook's heavy stomp meant someone had burned the bread again. The light patter of the lady's maid in the hall meant he needed to disappear quickly, lest someone accuse him of staring too long. Adric knew the walls echoed, and that some things were never meant to be heard, but he listened anyway. He had begun to spend more of his hours in the castle's older wings, areas with damp stone and winding corridors, where servants moved like ghosts and noblemen rarely stepped. These were the service routes, hidden passages built into the castle long ago. No tapestries hung here, no stained glass windows let in color. It was cold, always, and the air smelled of mildew and wax. But Adric liked it. He liked how the footsteps softened behind the walls, how voices floated through cracks between bricks. He liked that he could pause, just for a moment, and hear secrets not meant for him. Sometimes a knight would mutter about coin. Sometimes a chambermaid would cry. And sometimes, on rare, chilling occasions, Adric heard nothing at all. Not a breath, not a whisper. Just silence where there should be life. That, he came to learn, was the sound of something changing. One autumn evening, when the air outside was thick with the smell of burning leaves and damp hay, Adric was asked to take food to the tower guard. The sun had dipped behind the western hills, and the torches along the wall had not yet been lit. He carried the tray carefully, bread, dried meat, a cup of wine, his footsteps careful on the narrow steps. The tower overlooked the eastern road. From there, you could see the rolling fields, the distant treetops, and beyond them, the edge of another lord's land. It was the place where threats would first appear. The old guard, Master Conric, stood leaning on his spear, looking out over the valley. "Late?" the man grunted without turning his head. Adric placed the tray down and nodded. "The cook had words with a rat, sir. She won." Conric snorted, a rare chuckle escaping from the corner of his mouth. "That she-devil fights dirtier than any soldier I've ever known." For a moment they stood in silence, the boy and the man. Then Conric spoke again. "You ever wonder what's beyond those trees?" Adric hesitated. "I think there are more castles, and villages, farms perhaps." "Aye, and more war, more taxes, more men who want more than they need." He picked up the cup and sipped, then turned toward Adric, his eyes narrowing. "Don't get too curious, boy. Curiosity gets you seen, and being seen in places like this, it doesn't end well." Adric nodded. He understood. In the castle, visibility was a kind of danger. The less people noticed you, the safer you were. That night, after he returned to the servant quarters, he lay awake for a long time, staring at the low beams above his head. He thought about what Conric had said, about curiosity, about being seen. But even so, he couldn't help himself. In the weeks that followed, Adric began to explore more of the hidden paths. He found stairs that curved behind the walls of the chapel. He discovered a thin, crumbling door behind the laundry shelves that led to an old, dusty room filled with forgotten tapestries and cracked statues. and once, behind the hall where the lords held council, he found a spot where the stone was thin enough that he could hear the conversations clearly. That was when the world truly began to open. He heard of deals and debts, of secret alliances and private insults. He learned which noble was quietly furious with the king, and which one paid bribes to stay in favor. He heard the steward speak to someone in hushed tones about moving silver under cover of night. And most of all, he began to understand something no one ever told him. Power was not just about swords and titles. It was about knowledge, about who heard what and when. Adric said nothing to anyone. He kept his eyes lowered and his mouth shut, but his ears remained open. He kept track of every name, every whisper, every passing mention of war or betrayal. He didn't understand all of it yet, but he knew it mattered. One night, during a sudden winter storm, Adric found himself in the hall outside the lady's chambers, delivering warmed stones for her feet. As he walked down the corridor, a voice called him. "You there, boy." It was Sir Wymond, one of the youngest knights, tall with hair like ash and eyes sharp as broken glass. "You've grown taller," he said, narrowing his eyes. "How long have you been in this castle?" Adric swallowed. 10 years, sir." 10? You remember things then?" "Sometimes, sir." Sir Wymond stepped closer. "Sometimes is enough. Tell me, do you know which servant tends to Lord Farron's letters?" Adric blinked. A test. "I believe it is Marta, sir, the steward's niece." Wymond smiled, a thin line across his face. "Good. That will be all." He walked away, his boots silent on the rug. Adric stood still for a long time after. He realized then that he was no longer invisible. Someone had seen him, and that was how things began to change. He returned to his mat that night, feeling both heavier and taller. Not in body, but in understanding. The castle was not just a place where kings ruled and servants scrubbed floors. It was a web, and he had begun to feel the threads. Winter came quickly that year. The trees had barely turned gold before the frost began to creep across the castle stones like a patient spider. Fires were lit in every hall, but they barely cut through the cold. The breath of servants fogged in the air as they worked, and the straw-stuffed mattresses in the sleeping quarters felt more like slabs of ice than places of rest. But even through the discomfort, the rhythm of life continued. Lords still argued about land, ladies whispered behind lace veils. Servants scrubbed harder and moved faster, their hands red from freezing water, their feet numb from the chill. Adric, now nearly 16, had learned to move so quietly he often startled others without meaning to. He no longer flinched when nobles barked orders or when drunk knights stumbled too close. He had learned what to say, when to say it, and more importantly, when to say nothing at all. One evening, as snow fell thick outside the windows and the great hearths roared with logs, Adric was called to deliver wine to the small council. They were meeting in the solar, a high chamber lined with maps, books, and sealed scrolls. It was not a place servants lingered. He balanced the tray with care and entered silently, keeping his eyes down. The lords barely noticed him. Lord Farron was speaking in a low voice, and the others leaned in to hear. "If word travels to the North Tower, we'll have more than snow to contend with. The letters must not leave this castle." "I agree," said another voice, "but the king, he must not know until the moment is right." The king. Adric's ear twitched at the word. The king was an old man now, slow to speak and slower to trust. He spent most days in a chamber that smelled of lavender and wood smoke, surrounded by a handful of favorites and far from the rumblings of power. Adric placed the goblets carefully and retreated, but not before hearing one more whisper from Lord Farron. "We are not servants to a ghost." It was a bold thing to say, dangerous. Adric thought about those words as he descended the narrow staircase, the torches throwing tall shadows on the walls around him. Not servants to a ghost. That was how they saw the king now. Not a ruler, but a memory still wearing a crown. He took the long path back to the lower quarters, weaving through the back halls. His steps echoed softly. Somewhere above him he heard the slow toll of a bell, a quiet one, used only during illness or warning. That night the castle seemed unusually still. A storm was coming, perhaps, but not just from the sky. In the weeks that followed, the mood changed. There were more guards in the halls. Fewer letters were carried out by the usual messengers. Lords met in pairs behind heavy doors, and the king, though rarely seen, had his name whispered with a new urgency. Then one morning the news came quietly, like snow on rooftops. The king had fallen ill. The castle did not panic. No bells rang aloud. No proclamations were made. But every person inside its walls felt the shift. Meals were quieter. Servants avoided eye contact. The courtyards emptied of idle chatter, and in corners and stairwells people whispered to one another in low tones. Adric was summoned to assist in the outer corridor of the king's wing, though he was never allowed to enter. His task was simple: wait and respond to any request from the attending chamberlain. Hours passed. Cold drafts slipped through the cracks. He stood motionless, listening again, not just to footsteps or murmurs, but to the silence that hung like thick fog. He heard no weeping from inside, no prayers, just the shuffling of fabric and the occasional clink of a spoon in broth. After several days it became clear that the king was not recovering. Rumors said he slept most of the time, that he did not eat, that he spoke names of the dead in his dreams. One evening, as Adric waited once more, the door opened slightly and a figure stepped out. Not the chamberlain, but a man in dark robes, face lined and eyes unreadable. He looked at Adric with neither kindness nor suspicion. Simply looked. "Go fetch warm water," he said quietly. "Then return." Adric did as he was told. When he came back, the man took the bucket and disappeared behind the door once more. Nothing was said. Nothing explained. The door shut with a dull click. That night Adric lay awake in the servants' dormitory, the sounds of distant wind rattling the shutters. He felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, not exactly. It was the same feeling he had as a child when the floor beneath the keep groaned after a hard rain, as if something heavy deep within the stone was moving. A few days later, at dawn, the bells finally tolled, slow, deep, mournful. The king was dead. There was no ceremony yet, no public mourning. Just that sound, a toll repeated every hour, a reminder to all within the walls that something had ended. But what began in its place? Adric noticed how quickly things changed. The chamberlain began holding quiet meetings with Lord Farron. Nobles arrived from distant lands, cloaked and silent, their faces unreadable. The queen was rarely seen, and when she was, her face was pale, her mouth set in a line of stone. For the first time in his life, Adric saw the castle not as a place of strength, but as a thing uncertain. Power shifted here like dust in a shaft of light, visible only if you looked at just the right moment. And Adric had been looking for years. Now, as he moved silently from hall to hall, he saw more than just lords and servants. He saw plays being made, alliances forming, glances exchanged across candlelit tables. He did not know yet what they would lead to, but he knew enough to understand that everything was changing. And somehow, without permission, without title or name, he was already in the middle of it. The days after the king's death stretched on like a shadow without end. Though the bells had tolled, and though the news had passed quietly from lips to ears throughout the stone corridors, the castle itself had not truly grieved. There were no grand processions, no loud wails of sorrow echoing through the halls. Instead, there was a strange kind of hush that settled over everything, like snow blanketing the earth, soft, silent, and heavy. The nobles wore dark colors now, but their eyes did not look downcast. They were focused, watchful, some even a little too bright. The queen had retreated to her own chambers, and though her mourning veil hung thick and black around her face, those who served near her said she had not shed a single tear. Rumors said she spent her time writing letters by candlelight, pacing the floor, or speaking with the steward long after the rest of the court had gone to bed. Adric had not been called to the king's wing again. That part of the castle had fallen quiet. The old man's body had been prepared, they said, and placed in the family crypt beneath the chapel, where his ancestors lay in silence. But no one had seen it happen. There had been no moment to say goodbye. For most, it was as if the king had simply vanished into the stone. On the fourth night after the bells first rang, Adric was asked to bring fresh linens to the queen's chambers. He did not see her, only the handmaid who took the folded cloth from him and nodded, tired-eyed. But in that brief exchange, Adric caught a glimpse of the queen's inner room through the half-open door, a desk covered in scrolls and a tall chair turned toward the hearth, where a fire burned low. The scent of ink and lavender hung faintly in the air. He returned to his duties as if nothing had passed between them. That was the way of the castle. You could witness the edge of history and still be expected to carry water or sweep ash the next moment. Servants were not part of the stories, only the ones who remembered them. The shift of power came not with horns or banners, but with new faces. By the end of the week, riders arrived bearing the sigils of distant houses. They brought trunks of clothing, crates of wine, and long, covered objects wrapped in wool. Young lords stepped into the castle's great hall with confident strides, their boots clean of mud, their eyes darting like hawks. Ladies with high collars and veiled hats spoke in hushed tones behind gloved hands. Something was being arranged. Everyone felt it, but no one said it aloud. Then came Lord Alric. He was tall, with silver streaking his hair and the calm face of a man who knew the rules of every game. He wore no crown, but his presence filled the hall like thunder. People moved when he passed. Even Lord Farron, who had been whispering in corners for weeks, stepped aside when Alric entered a room. No one declared him king. Not yet. But Adric noticed how often his name was spoken, how often his orders were followed, how his seat at the high table was already draped in the royal blue velvet that once belonged to the old king. One evening, Adric was tasked with bringing mulled wine to the private library. He carried the tray carefully, the cups balanced with a steady hand. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by oil lamps and the flicker of the hearth. Lord Alric sat at the long table, flanked by two men in simple tunics with wax-sealed parchments spread before them. They did not notice Adric at first. He stood still, listening. "The crown is just a shape," Alric said calmly. "What matters is who fills it." The other men nodded. "And the queen?" one asked. "She will do what must be done. She understands what's at stake." Adric placed the tray gently on the corner table and withdrew, unnoticed again. But as he closed the door behind him, he understood something clearly. The new king had already taken his throne. Only the ceremony remained. The next day, the castle began to shift again. Flags were changed. The royal crest was repainted in the great hall, though the colors remained the same. More soldiers arrived, and they were not the same ones Adric had grown up seeing. These wore darker armor and did not laugh in the kitchens. They took their meals in silence and slept near their swords. Adric continued his work, but with sharper attention. He saw how the old chamberlain was replaced by a younger man with a quicker temper. He noticed how the steward's records were moved to a new chamber and how some names on the servant rolls began to disappear. No one asked where those people went. Everyone had learned that silence was the safest language in times like this. Late one night, as snow fell again and the wind howled outside the stone walls, Adric found himself in the armory corridor, returning a borrowed cloak. The corridor was empty, cold, lined with racks of spears and polished shields. But as he passed one of the narrow arrow-slit windows, he paused. Outside, in the courtyard below, he saw Lord Alric standing with the queen. She wore a thick black cloak and held a letter in her hand. Alric said something to her, softly but firmly. She did not respond. After a long silence, she turned and walked away, disappearing beneath the covered walkway. Alric remained in place a moment longer, then followed. Adric stood frozen. Something was not right. Power had passed hands, but not all hands agreed to the exchange. Back in the servant quarters, the others joked softly about the new king and what foods he preferred. But Adric said nothing. He lay in his straw mattress and stared at the ceiling. He had served one king already, and now another. He had been invisible long enough to see truths that others missed. And now, in the shifting cold of winter, he began to wonder how many more crowns would rise and fall before the snow melted again. He wasn't part of the story. Not yet. But perhaps someday, someone might look back and wonder who had watched it all unfold, and Adric would remember. While power changed hands in the high halls and chambers of stone, the castle's kitchen remained the warmest place in the entire fortress. The scent of roasting meat and boiling herbs hung constantly in the air. Fires crackled in great hearths where iron pots hissed and spat. The long wooden tables were never clear, always filled with trays of dough, baskets of roots, or bundles of herbs waiting to be chopped. Adric found comfort there, though he was not one of the kitchen hands he often passed through with errands, delivering messages, picking up food trays, or simply brushing the soot off his sleeves near the fire when the frost outside became too much to bear. The cook, a round woman named Marta, had run that kitchen since before Adric was born. She wielded her wooden spoon like a scepter and shouted at her staff like a general marshalling troops for battle. But she had a kind heart, and when Adric showed up, she always handed him a warm crust of bread without asking. It was in the kitchen that whispers grew bold. "You didn't hear it from me," Marta muttered one morning as she pounded dough, "but the queen's been locked away, not sick, not grieving, watched, like a prisoner." Adric's hands slowed as he polished a silver tray. He said nothing, but Marta leaned closer. "They say the new king wants no surprises, wants no loose ends." He nodded slightly, pretending not to care, but his stomach turned. The kitchen boys spoke of other things. Lord Alric's soldiers, they said, had confiscated 3 barrels of wine meant for the festival. "Took it straight to the tower," one lad whispered. Another said that old Master Revan, the herbalist, had been dismissed, sent away without notice. Just gone. "Too many changes," Marta grumbled, "and not all good ones." By then, Adric had learned how to listen without being noticed. He learned to stir stew slowly while picking out fragments of important talk, and though he never spoke of what he heard, he was beginning to build a picture in his mind, one not painted in words but in gestures, silences, and sudden disappearances. That winter was long and cruel. Snow piled in high drifts against the castle walls, and the wind screamed through the towers like a living thing. Fires had to be kept burning through the night, and even in the servant quarters, extra blankets were handed out. But there was no comfort for the castle's mood. It had grown tense, watchful, like a forest full of sleeping wolves. One night, Adric was asked to carry a tray to the upper tower, where Lord Alric had taken residence. The tray held roast game hen, a goblet of mulled wine, and a small pot of honey. As he ascended the winding stone steps, the silence thickened with every floor. When he reached the tower door, the guards outside nodded silently. One opened the door for him. Adric entered with careful steps. Inside, the room was lit with just a few candles. Maps lay across the table. Lord Alric stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring into the night. Adric placed the tray gently on the sideboard. "Leave it," Alric said without turning. Adric bowed and turned to go, but the man spoke again. "You served my predecessor." It wasn't a question. Adric paused. "Yes, my lord." "And did he seem like a man of vision to you?" Adric hesitated. "He was careful." Lord Alric let out a small laugh, sharp, cold. "Careful men rule for years and leave behind nothing but dust." The wind howled against the windows. Adric didn't speak again. He waited for dismissal. "You can go." As Adric made his way down the tower stairs, heart pounding, he realized something important. Alric was no mere replacement. He had plans that reached far beyond the castle walls. Back in the kitchens, Marta muttered about missing supplies and soldiers who never smiled. Someone had broken into the stores last week. No one was punished, but 3 servants disappeared the day after. Another cook quit suddenly and fled to her brother's farm. No one questioned it out loud, but the silence left behind was louder than any scream. The castle's very air had changed. It wasn't just the cold. It was the sense that eyes were everywhere. Every step echoed too loudly. Every glance might be misunderstood. The servants spoke in hushed tones, kept their eyes low, and avoided the places where shadows gathered thickest. Still, Adric kept working. That was what servants did. Through wars, births, deaths, and betrayals, they worked. He scrubbed steps, polished wood, fetched scrolls, and trimmed wicks. His life remained tied to the rhythm of the place, But now every errand felt like a thread pulling him closer to something dangerous. Then came the feast. It was unannounced, uncelebrated, yet extravagant. Roasted pheasants, trays of sugared fruit, flagons of strong wine. No musicians were called, and no guests from the villages arrived. Only nobles and soldiers, those loyal to Lord Alric. They toasted in silence, shared looks over long tables, and made speeches that were more veiled warnings than celebrations. Adric served wine at the feast. He poured quietly, moved without notice, but he watched everything. He saw the queen enter the hall, escorted, stiff, a ghost of her former self. Her eyes scanned the crowd, but found no allies. She sat at Alric's left. He smiled at her, and she did not smile back. That was the night Eadric knew. Something would break. Not that night. Not in the days that followed, but the balance of power had grown too fragile. There were too many secrets now, too many faces that hid fear behind polite nods. The castle was no longer just a place of stone and banners. It was a vessel filling with storm. And Eadric? He remained a servant. But his eyes had opened, and once opened, they did not close again. The castle garden was not large, but it was old, and it felt older than anything else within those stone walls. Twisting ivy covered the arches, roses bloomed even in strange seasons, and a small fountain gurgled in the center like it had done for centuries. You did not often come here. Servants were not welcome without purpose. But today you were told to bring a tray of fruit and wine for the queen, who was walking slowly beneath the stone arches with her lady-in-waiting. You moved quietly, your footsteps barely audible on the cobbled path, the silver tray trembling slightly in your hands from both its weight and your nerves. The queen was not cruel, but she was distant, cold in a way that made you feel as if your presence was a faint annoyance. Her face was pale, framed by a white linen veil, her gown rich with golden thread. As you approached, her eyes flicked to you and then away, as though your figure was just part of the garden's background. You lowered your head, placed the tray on a marble bench, and stepped back quickly, your gaze fixed on the mossy stones beneath your shoes. You did not leave at once. The lady-in-waiting gestured for you to remain, and so you stood by the fountain, hands clasped behind your back, as the queen sipped her wine and spoke in hushed tones. At first her words were soft enough to blur with the rustle of wind through leaves, but then something caught your ear, a name, quickly spoken, then repeated. The name of a neighboring duke, the one who had once tried to marry into the royal family but had been denied. Your eyes didn't move. You dared not glance up, but your ears listened, because you could not help it. The queen was speaking of alliances and betrayals, of secret letters and coded messages. Nothing was said outright, but the meaning slipped through the cracks in their voices like water through cupped hands. Something was being planned, something that would shift the air in the castle. Later that evening, when the sky had turned to smoke and the castle glowed with torchlight, you found yourself summoned by the steward. He had gray eyes that never blinked too long, and he always smelled of ink and parchment. He asked if you had heard anything during your service in the garden. You said no, of course not, and lowered your head, hoping your voice did not waver. He watched you for a long moment before dismissing you with a nod. As you walked away, you felt his gaze on your back like the weight of a second cloak. From that night on, you knew something had changed. Not in the castle alone, but in you. The garden became a place of whispers. You were sent there more often now, always with something small, herbs, tea, a folded note. And always the same quiet voices, the same cautious glances over the shoulder. Sometimes you were forgotten for a moment, and in those times you learned more than any servant was meant to know. You learned that peace was not steady, that kings did not sleep easily, and that queens held more secrets than soldiers held swords. One afternoon, as you gathered fallen petals from the path, a man you did not recognize stepped into the garden. He wore a simple tunic but carried himself like someone important. He walked directly to you and asked your name, not harshly, but with a tone that demanded truth. You gave it. He asked if you were loyal to the crown. You said yes, though your heart began to beat like a drum inside your chest. He handed you a small pouch and said, "For your silence." And then he walked away without another word. You did not open the pouch until nightfall. Inside were 2 silver coins, more than you earned in a week. You stared at them under the flickering light of your candle and felt the ground shift beneath your feet. It was not about the coins, it was about what they meant. Someone thought you mattered. Someone thought your silence could be bought. That made you dangerous. That made you useful. That made you something more than just a servant. But you were still afraid. Each day that followed felt heavier than the one before. Every glance, every passing night in the corridor, every nobleman whispering in corners. They all seemed like shadows watching you. You cleaned the queen's chamber and wondered if she knew. You brushed past the steward and wondered if he'd seen the pouch. You carried trays, swept ashes, polished goblets, and with each movement you thought, they must know. But no one said a word. And so the garden, once a quiet place of vines and silence, became your stage. You were not a servant anymore, not just that. You were part of something. You didn't understand the whole of it, but you were caught in its web, and you didn't know how to escape. Sometimes in the deep of night you returned to the garden. The moon would shine pale over the stones, and the fountain would whisper its endless song. You would sit on the cold bench where the queen once rested and stare at the empty path. You wanted to ask the garden what to do, but it had no answers. Only petals. Only silence. The castle had grown quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like the walls were listening. Footsteps seemed softer. Conversations cut short when others passed by. Even the wind through the courtyard seemed to hesitate. You felt it in your bones, that strange stillness before something breaks. And in the middle of it, you were expected to act like nothing had changed. You still rose before the sun, washed your face in the cold stone basin, tied your apron, and began the day. The chores were the same. Sweep the great hall, polish the brass on the stair rails, scrub soot from the kitchen hearth. Your hands moved like they always had, but your mind no longer wandered. It was fixed now, always listening, always watching. You were carrying something, even if you couldn't name it. You hadn't told anyone about the silver coins. They were wrapped in a cloth and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the back of the storeroom. Sometimes you checked on them just to be sure they were still there. You didn't spend them. You didn't want them. But their weight in your life had changed things. They were a reminder that you weren't invisible anymore, and that frightened you more than it thrilled you. One rainy afternoon, you were told to carry a sealed scroll to the library. The castle's library wasn't a place you usually went. It smelled of candle wax and old paper, and the shelves stretched far above your head. The librarian was a quiet man, always hunched with ink-stained fingers. He rarely looked anyone in the eye. When you handed him the scroll, he examined the wax seal before taking it. His eyes met yours for a second longer than they needed to. Then, instead of tucking the scroll away, he slid open a drawer in his desk and placed it inside with great care. "Some books," he said softly, "aren't written with ink." You didn't understand what he meant, but the words stayed with you. That same night you passed the steward in the corridor. He paused, looked at you, and asked if you had any family outside the castle. The question came out of nowhere, and for a moment you didn't know what to say. "None alive," you answered honestly. He nodded and said nothing more, but the look on his face told you he had been testing something. Perhaps your answer had settled something in his mind, or unsettled it. You returned to your quarters with a tightness in your chest. You lay on your straw mattress, staring at the low ceiling, listening to the rain tapping gently on the shutters. You began to think, what did they want from you? Why were people speaking in riddles, handing you coins, and asking strange questions? By the next day, the queen's personal maid, an older woman with sharp eyes and a mouth like a tightened purse, pulled you aside. She asked you to assist her with some sewing repairs for the queen's travel gowns. "We'll be leaving within the week," she said. "The king wants to visit the southern fortress." You hadn't known that. News of travel plans rarely reached your ears. But now, even that seemed like a clue. Every little detail became something you tried to piece together. You worked in the sewing room until your fingers were sore. The maid rarely spoke, but once, when the others stepped away, she leaned close to you and whispered, "Stay quiet. Whatever you've seen, pretend you haven't. You're safer that way." She didn't wait for your reply. She didn't even look at you again. She just returned to folding the gowns like nothing had happened. Later, while carrying laundry up the narrow servant stairs, you saw something that made you stop. 2 knights, ones you'd never seen before, were being led through the castle by a man in dark robes. They weren't wearing the king's colors, they bore no banners, and they looked like men who weren't meant to be noticed, but you noticed them. And they noticed you. One of them, a tall one with a jagged scar running down his jaw, met your gaze as you passed. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. But his eyes lingered, cold and still. You hurried past, trying to calm your breath, trying to tell yourself that maybe they were just visitors, just travelers, but your gut told you otherwise. And in this place, your gut was often wiser than logic. That night, you stood by the kitchen door, watching the sky turn purple over the hills. You could smell stew from the cauldron behind you, hear the scullery boy humming as he scrubbed pots. But your thoughts were heavy. Something was coming. You didn't know what, but it was moving toward the castle like a slow wave, and you were stuck in its path. You didn't ask for any of this. You had only wanted a simple life, a place to sleep, work to do, and food in your belly. But now people were handing you coins, speaking warnings and staring like they expected something from you. And what could you do? You were a servant, just a servant. No sword, no title, no power. But still, you knew things. And in a castle like this, sometimes knowing things was more dangerous than holding a blade. The days grew colder. You could feel it in the stone floors first, how they chilled your feet no matter how thick your socks were. The firewood brought up from the stores burned faster now, and the castle hearths never seemed warm enough. People moved more briskly in the corridors, heads low, shoulders hunched against invisible winds. The mood had shifted again, subtly but certainly, as if winter wasn't just in the air but also in people's hearts. You had taken to watching people more carefully now, not out of curiosity but necessity. Something was building, an undercurrent that made every simple task feel like a test. You found yourself memorizing glances passed between knights in the courtyard, noting which servants were suddenly quiet, and which nobles left dinners early with unreadable expressions. It was like being in a room full of loaded crossbows, all waiting for someone to trip the wire. One evening you were sent to help prepare the smaller feast hall for a private supper. You didn't ask questions, no servant in their right mind would, but you noticed the differences. No minstrels were called, no extra wine was poured. The usual silverware was replaced with older, simpler sets. It was meant to feel ordinary, but it didn't. As you arranged the goblets on the table, a tall figure entered, Lady Aveline, one of the Queen's closest ladies in waiting. You'd always admired her calm grace, how she spoke softly but with such authority that even the steward gave her room to speak. Today, though, her eyes were darting. She wasn't calm. She was alert, watching shadows, listening for footsteps. When she saw you, she didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, glanced over her shoulder, and then placed a folded piece of parchment into your apron pocket. "Burn it," she whispered, "but read it first. Then forget it existed." You stood frozen, unsure if she had truly said what you heard, or if you had imagined it. But the weight of the paper was real. You felt it against your leg like it was made of iron. You didn't even finish setting the goblets. As soon as you were out of sight, you ducked into the corner behind the kitchens, where the walls met at a crooked angle and the wind couldn't reach. With trembling fingers, you unfolded the note. It was short, written in hurried ink. "The visitors in black are not emissaries. They've been here before, under a different king. Ask no one, trust no one. Leave if you can." Your throat tightened. You folded it back up, stared at it for a moment, and then found the nearest candle flame and held the edge of the parchment to it. The fire curled it, darkened the words, then turned the paper to ash in seconds. You watched the ashes scatter into the wind, but your thoughts couldn't be so easily burned. That night, you hardly slept. Every creak in the wooden beams above your cot, every gust of wind outside, made your heart jolt. You wondered about the last time those visitors had been here. What had happened then? Was it war? A betrayal? Had someone been silenced? The next day, the steward informed you that the king and queen would remain in the castle for winter, canceling the planned travel to the southern fortress. No reason was given. The servants were told to prepare the upper rooms for long-term stay. It sounded routine, but to you it felt like a pivot, a change of plan made in response to a threat. You wondered if the threat was within the walls or beyond them. You noticed the guards at the main gate had doubled, the armory had new locks, and down in the wine cellar, where you sometimes fetched bottles for the steward, you saw a soldier standing watch, an unusual sight for a place usually left to rats and barrels. Then came the day the royal falconer was dismissed. He had served 2 kings faithfully, and everyone liked him. No reason was offered. Just one quiet morning, he was gone. Some said he had fallen ill. Others said he had been sent away for stealing royal goods. But those of you who had seen him the night before knew he had looked healthy, proud, and completely unsuspecting. His removal was a message, though no one could quite read it. In the laundry room that afternoon, while folding sheets with 2 other servants, one of them, an older woman with silver hair and a crooked back, leaned close and said, "You've seen them too, haven't you? The ones in black?" You didn't answer. You just folded faster. But she took your silence as confirmation. "They don't belong here," she added, "but they come when blood is due. Always have." That sentence lived in your mind like a ghost for the rest of the day. Blood is due. You thought about the lords who had grown quieter, the queen who seemed more watchful, the sealed scroll in the library drawer, and the falconer who vanished without a trace. Everything felt like it was circling some dark secret, and somehow you had stumbled into its path. At the end of the day, as dusk fell and the castle sank into its usual shadowed calm, you climbed to the north tower alone. You told the steward you were sent to dust the banners. That wasn't true. You just needed air, a moment alone. From up there you could see the forest stretching like an ocean, black and endless. The castle looked so small from above, like it couldn't possibly hold the storm that brewed within. The castle had never felt so quiet. After the strange silence that followed the feast, the days stretched long and uneasy. You still carried out your chores, sweeping flagstones, tending the fires, and fetching water from the cold well. But something had changed. The air in the halls felt heavier, like the walls were listening. People moved about more cautiously, as though unseen eyes followed their every step. The bustling energy that once filled the place had drained away, replaced by whispered conversations and sideways glances. It was on one of these heavy gray afternoons that you found yourself alone in the main hall, polishing silver at the long table beneath the high stained glass windows. The fire behind you crackled faintly, throwing shifting light onto the worn stone floor. The scent of old wax and wood smoke lingered in the air. You were halfway through buffing a serving tray when you heard it, a quiet, dragging sound like something heavy scraping against stone. At first you thought it might be the wind outside, rattling the shutters, but it came again, slow and deliberate. You turned your head slightly, heart pounding. The sound was coming from behind the tapestry. The tapestry had always hung there, showing a faded scene of knights and lions. You had dusted it 100 times, but today, as you stared at its frayed edges, you realized something was off. The air near it felt colder. You set down the tray and moved closer, your footsteps muffled by the thick rug. Lifting the edge of the cloth slowly, your breath caught in your throat. Behind it, partly hidden in the stone wall, was a narrow seam, a door, a hidden one. You didn't touch it at first, just looked, trying to decide if your eyes were playing tricks. The outline was clear, almost too clear, as if it had only recently been opened. You stepped back just as quickly, heart racing. What was this? Why was there a secret door here, in a hall you'd worked in nearly every day, and why now, after all this silence, had it stirred? You didn't have much time to wonder. Footsteps sounded on the stairs, firm and quick. You dropped the tapestry, backed away from the wall, and hurried back to your silver polishing. A guard entered the hall, but paid you no attention, walking straight across toward the kitchens. Still your hands trembled as you worked. The image of the hidden door lingered behind your eyes. impossible to shake. Later that night, as you lay in your chamber staring at the beams above, you thought of the scraping sound, of how the seam in the stone had seemed almost alive, and how your name had not been spoken once since the feast. It was like you had vanished from people's thoughts, left to drift among the corridors like a ghost yourself. The next day brought more questions. In the chapel, as you dusted near the altar, your eyes caught sight of a small folded parchment left where only the priest usually placed his sacred texts. It bore the Lord's seal, unusual, considering he rarely entered the chapel at all. No one else was around. You shouldn't have touched it, but you did. Inside was a single line written in a hurried, scratchy hand. Do not open the stone again. Speak of it to no one. Your skin went cold. Someone had seen you. Someone knew. You quickly refolded the parchment and set it back exactly where you found it, heart hammering. That evening, the kitchen staff avoided your gaze. The steward gave you tasks far from others. It was as if a silent agreement had passed through the castle. Pretend nothing happened, or worse, pretend you no longer existed. The castle grew darker, colder. At night, the wind howled through the towers, moaning against the shutters. You'd wake often, clutching your blanket, your mind replaying that faint scraping noise again and again. The Lord no longer dined with the household. The lady was nowhere to be seen. No one asked questions aloud, but you saw the fear in their eyes. One afternoon, while drawing water from the courtyard well, the stable boy approached you, his face pale. He leaned close and whispered, "Don't go near the hall again. They're watching it now." Before you could reply, he turned and hurried away, vanishing behind the stables. You didn't know if he was warning you as a friend or repeating something he'd been told to say. That evening, when you passed by the great hall on your way to the storeroom, you paused. The tapestry fluttered slightly, though there was no breeze. You took a step closer, then stopped. You could feel something behind that wall, a presence almost, watching, waiting. You hurried away, heart pounding, refusing to look back. In the quiet of your small chamber, you considered your choices. You could tell someone, but who would believe you? The steward already avoided your eyes. The guards were loyal only to the Lord. And if the Lord himself had left that note, warning you to stay silent, then what would happen if you disobeyed? There was no one to trust. Only silence. Only stone. That night, sleep did not come easily. You sat wrapped in your blanket, listening to every creak of wood, every distant footstep. You had discovered something meant to stay hidden, and now you feared it might change everything. You told yourself you would stay away from the tapestry. You told yourself it was none of your concern, but deep down you knew that curiosity, once awakened, never truly goes quiet. You had seen the door, and you had heard it move. The days grew shorter as the wind began to howl through the narrow windows of the castle like a distant cry from the mountains. With each passing day, the sun seemed to rise later and sink sooner, casting long shadows in the hallways. The cold, always present in old stone buildings, now seemed to bite deeper. Fires were lit earlier and kept burning later, and still your fingers were numb by midday. And yet, none of that troubled you as much as the memory of the hidden door behind the tapestry. Ever since you had seen it, nothing felt the same. It wasn't just that you had stumbled upon a secret, it was the feeling that the castle itself had noticed you. You had lived within its walls for years, nearly invisible, no more important than a broom or a candlestick. But now you sensed something different. The air felt thicker when you walked near the great hall. The walls seemed to hold in their silence longer, and occasionally you thought you could hear something, low murmurs that didn't quite come from anyone you could see. One morning, before the rest of the servants were awake, you found yourself drawn back to the hall. You didn't plan to go there, not really, but your feet took you all the same. The corridor was dim, the only light coming from the dying embers of the torches along the wall. You stood before the tapestry, heart thudding, and listened. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, just as you began to turn away, you heard it again. The faintest whisper of stone, shifting against stone. You froze. It was unmistakable now. Something moved behind the wall. You wanted to run, but your legs didn't obey. Instead, your hand reached out and touched the edge of the tapestry again. The fabric felt colder than before, almost damp. You lifted it slowly, afraid of what you might find, but the door was closed, seamless, nearly invisible once more. Still, the coldness remained, seeping into your fingers and up your arm, as if the stone itself remembered your touch. A soft voice echoed in your memory. "Don't open the stone again." You dropped the tapestry, heart racing, and walked away quickly, trying to shake the sense that something had been listening. Over the next few days, your chores became more difficult to focus on. You spilled water, overcooked bread, and even forgot to stir the Lord's evening broth. The steward scolded you in front of others, his voice louder than usual, as if to remind you that you were still beneath notice, still only a servant. But you saw the flicker of something else in his eyes, fear or perhaps suspicion. Then came the night you truly knew you were being watched. You were on your way to the lower cellar, carrying a basket of dried herbs to be stored for winter. The staircase to the cellar was narrow and twisted, and you moved slowly, mindful not to slip on the damp steps. But halfway down, you heard footsteps behind you, soft, deliberate. You turned, but the stairwell was empty. You waited, holding your breath. Nothing. Still, the feeling clung to you like smoke. You rushed the rest of the way down, dropped off the herbs, and fled back to the kitchen, the sound of your own breathing loud in your ears. That night, you didn't sleep. You sat on the edge of your small straw bed, staring at the door, waiting for a knock that never came. The next morning, the castle was buzzing. One of the guards had gone missing. No one knew when he'd last been seen, though someone mentioned they thought he was on watch near the great hall. A hush fell over the servants. The cook crossed herself. The scullery maid cried in the pantry. You kept your head down. But inside, something churned. Was this connected to the door, or was it coincidence? You weren't sure anymore what to believe. All you knew was that the castle was hiding something, and now you were a part of it. By late afternoon, the sun had disappeared behind thick clouds. The air smelled of rain, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm hit just as the evening bells rang, rattling the shutters and drenching the courtyard in minutes. You found yourself assigned to keep watch on a small fire in the eastern corridor, an odd task given that few ever passed that way. Still, you obeyed, grateful at least to be alone for a while. You sat by the hearth, feeding it bits of dried wood, trying not to let your mind wander. But the castle was too quiet, and then, in the dancing glow of the firelight, you saw it again, just a flicker in the corner of your eye, a shadow that moved across the wall when nothing else had. You stood, walked toward it, and placed your hand on the stone. It felt warmer than before, like it had been touched recently. And then you heard it, a voice, low and barely audible, whispering something in a language you didn't recognize. It didn't come from behind you or in front of you. It came from inside the wall. You stumbled backward, the firelight jumping across the stones. The voice stopped. Silence. You backed away, breath shallow. Whatever was happening in this castle, it wasn't done yet. And you were no longer just a servant. You were involved, tied to a mystery far older than your time here, and perhaps far more dangerous. You left the corridor and hurried to your chamber, locking the door behind you. You sat in silence for hours, staring at the flames of your small candle until they burned low. The days that followed passed with a strange stillness. Even though the castle was alive with the usual rhythm of footsteps, voices, and clanging pots, there was a sense of something waiting, coiled, quiet, watching. You did your duties more carefully than ever, not out of discipline, but caution. You were being watched. You felt it in the way silence gathered behind you in empty hallways, in how the shadows seemed darker than they should be, in how even your fellow servants avoided your eyes. Whether they knew what you knew or simply sensed the weight of it pressing around you, you couldn't tell. But the tension clung to the stones and drifted in the air like the first hint of rot before a storm. And then, one fog-choked morning, you were told to deliver a tray to the western wing. You froze at the request. The western wing was supposed to be sealed, closed after the great fire that had happened long before your time. No one went there. Not the steward, not the guards, not even the rats, or so people said. Its windows were broken and boarded, and the ivy had crept in through the cracks like silent fingers trying to claim the stone back to the forest. But there had been a quiet arrival last night. 2 cloaked riders escorted in with no fanfare, and now someone in that forgotten part of the castle had summoned food and wine. You carried the tray with both hands, its warmth seeping into your palms as you crossed the threshold into the old wing. The heavy wooden door creaked open with a protest that echoed down the corridor, and then silence swallowed everything behind you. The air changed immediately. It smelled old, older than dust and stone, older than fire, like wet earth and something bitter, metallic. You walked forward slowly, the tray trembling just enough for the spoon to rattle in its bowl. There were no candles here, no torches, just grey light slipping through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, painting the walls in stripes like prison bars. The hallway seemed longer than it should be, and every footstep sounded like it belonged to someone else. You didn't speak. You didn't call out. Somehow you knew that whoever, or whatever, had called for food would already be waiting. You reached the chamber door, one unlike the others. It hadn't been burned, not completely. The black marks on the frame stopped just short of the latch, as though the fire had refused to touch this room. You knocked once, gently, but no voice answered. With trembling fingers, you pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by a single candle on the far table. 2 figures sat across from each other in silence. One was cloaked so completely that you could not even make out their face. The other was dressed in a style unfamiliar to you. Noble, yes, but with colors and trim you didn't recognize, and a ring on his finger that glinted too brightly in the candlelight. They didn't look at you. They didn't acknowledge you. But one of them, the one with the ring, gestured silently toward the table near the window. You set the tray down, careful not to make a sound, and yet, as you did, a whisper slid through the air behind you, words in a language you didn't speak but somehow understood. The stones remember. You froze, eyes wide. You turned around slowly, but neither figure had moved. You didn't wait. You stepped back from the table, nodded quickly, and left the room, pulling the door shut behind you, with hands that shook more than you cared to admit. You walked faster down the hallway, but the silence felt like it followed you. The air grew colder. A soft echo came from somewhere deep in the walls, almost like breathing. That night you couldn't sleep. You lay on your cot, the thin blanket doing nothing to keep out the chill. The voice, the whisper, wouldn't leave your mind. The stones remember. Remember what? The kings? The fire? The blood? You didn't know. But something told you that the stones beneath your feet had seen things long before your arrival, and they had not forgotten. The next morning the steward's voice pulled you out of your thoughts. He was standing in the center of the kitchen, his eyes sharper than usual, holding a scroll. "A message," he announced, "has come from the capital. The prince is coming to the castle. He will stay for 3 days. Everything must be perfect." The room buzzed with nervous energy. The prince? Here. That hadn't happened in years. His arrival meant danger, scrutiny, pressure, and secrets, especially secrets, had a way of unraveling when men with power came near. You tried to slip out quietly to fetch water, but the steward called your name. "You," he said, "you're to help prepare the old guest chambers, the ones near the chapel. Another forgotten wing, another silent part of the castle." You nodded, though your stomach turned. You wanted to scream, to say you didn't want to go back into the walls where the stones whispered, but your voice, like always, stayed silent. You spent the next hours dusting, scrubbing, and airing out the chambers. Each room held echoes, smells of incense and wax, old footprints long erased, walls that seemed to lean in closer the longer you stayed inside. You found a strange symbol carved into one of the bedposts, not fresh, not ancient either, just recent enough to feel deliberate. It wasn't a crest or a mark of ownership. It looked more like a warning. You brushed your fingers over it and felt a sudden drop in temperature, as if something had pulled heat out of the air. You turned quickly and saw a reflection in the window, not your own. A pale face, eyes deep set, watching, and then gone. You stepped back, knocking over a stool as you did. Your breath caught in your throat. You weren't alone in this part of the castle. But no one would believe you. Not here. Not now. The prince would arrive soon. The castle would come alive with ceremony and noise, with banners and trumpets and armor. But beneath it all, in the quiet corners where the stone met the shadows, something ancient was stirring. The prince's arrival was not the spectacle the older servants had whispered about in the days leading up to it. There were no grand horns, no parades of armored knights, and no fanfare of embroidered flags catching wind in the courtyard. He came quietly, under grey skies, with a retinue so small it almost felt wrong. Just 5 riders, cloaked and solemn, their horses moving slowly, as if reluctant to approach the castle. The prince himself didn't wear anything that set him apart from the others. No crown, no velvet cloak, not even the jeweled sword the royal men were always said to carry, but when he dismounted you could feel the weight of him in the air. He wasn't too large or loud. He moved like someone who didn't need to speak to be obeyed. His eyes scanned the castle slowly, and when they passed over you, something strange happened. He paused. Only for a second, but it was long enough for your heart to skip. He looked at you like he recognized something. Not your face, no, something deeper. Like he saw the fear you kept hidden, the dreams you didn't speak of, the secrets you hadn't even fully admitted to yourself. And then he looked away and continued toward the steps without a word. You stood still, long after he had passed, gripping the water pail so tightly your knuckles turned white. Inside the castle, everything shifted. The steward barked more orders than usual. The kitchen filled with more smoke than food. Servants scurried in hallways, brushing past each other with tense shoulders and wide eyes. No one liked having royalty under the roof. It wasn't just the pressure to impress. It was the danger. A royal guest meant noble visitors, which meant old politics, hidden grudges, and the quiet, cold danger of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Servants were always the first to feel the change in the wind, and now the wind felt sharp and cold. You were assigned to the prince's quarters, not to serve him directly, but to keep the outer rooms tidy, fetch anything his attendants needed, and stay out of sight. You worked quietly, your hands moving on instinct while your ears tried to catch bits of conversation from the next room. Most of what you heard were whispers. The prince rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was low and slow, like the settling of snow over dead branches. He asked few questions, and when he did, the men around him often took too long to answer, as if weighing each word. On the second night, a storm rolled in. Rain beat against the high windows, and the wind howled through the gaps in the stone walls. The castle groaned like an old ship caught in rough waters. That night, while refilling a jug outside the prince's chamber, you heard raised voices. Not shouts, just firm, urgent arguing. You couldn't hear everything, but you caught enough. Something about the western wing, about unfinished business, about the one who knows. The voices dropped quickly when they realized you were nearby. One of the attendants stepped out and gave you a look that froze your blood. "You didn't hear anything," he said quietly, "and you don't go near the west side again. Do you understand?" You nodded, mouth dry. Later that night, you found a piece of folded parchment tucked under your cot. It hadn't been there before. You knew because your cot was the same every night. Thin blanket, worn mattress, splintered legs. The note wasn't long, just a few words, written in a rushed, almost angry scrawl. "They remember you." That was it. No name, no explanation. Just those 3 words and the unsettling feeling they left behind. You didn't sleep at all. The following morning, something even stranger happened. One of the prince's horses had died. No one could explain how. It hadn't been injured, hadn't been sick. The stable hand who found it said it looked like it had frozen where it stood, mouth open, eyes wide, muscles stiff. The body was cold, despite the mild weather. Whispers flew through the servants' quarters. Some said it was poison, others claimed it was a sign, though no one could agree on what kind. You were asked to help with the burial, and as you stood near the pit with the shovels in hand, you noticed something carved into the horse's bridle, a small symbol, familiar in shape. It was the same one you had seen etched into the guest room bedpost days before. You didn't say a word. That evening you returned to your regular duties, though everything felt different now. The castle had always been strange, old, haunted in the way all places become after too much time passes. But now it felt alive, and not in a comforting way. It felt like the walls were breathing, like the wind carried messages meant only for those who were quiet enough to listen. You tried to stay out of sight, to disappear into your tasks like you always had, but it didn't work anymore. You were noticed now. The prince noticed you again that night. He caught your eye from across the hall as you were fetching towels. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once, just enough to be sure you saw it. It wasn't a friendly nod. It felt more like a signal, a test, or maybe a warning. Afterward, you returned to your cot and sat awake again, the parchment in your hands, reading the same 3 words over and over until the candle burned low. They remember you, and now you were beginning to remember something too. You weren't supposed to be there. The steward had warned everyone plainly. Servants were to avoid the western wing unless given written instruction. But as the days passed and the prince remained within the castle walls, the warnings had turned from spoken orders into something more ominous. It was no longer about authority, it was fear. No one wanted to go near that part of the castle. And yet, late one evening, as the sky outside melted from dusk into ink, you found yourself walking that way, led not by orders, but by a pull you couldn't quite name. It was curiosity, yes, but more than that, a deep hum under your skin that told you something in that forgotten corridor mattered, something waited for you. The western wing had once been used to house noble guests and visiting clergy, but it had fallen into disuse after the fire that took half its roof 20 years ago. Most of the structure had been repaired, but no one ever stayed there anymore. Its windows were fogged with dust, its door hinges rusted, and the hallway floors creaked beneath even the lightest steps. You walked slowly, every sound echoing too loudly in the silence, heart drumming steadily in your chest. With each step, the air grew colder. Not cold like winter, cold like the earth, like stone sealed for years without sunlight. It smelled faintly of smoke and something older, harder to place, like wilted pages and damp wood. The first door you passed was marked with a strange burn, a perfect circle etched into the wood, black and glossy. You paused only a second before moving on, your fingers trailing against the faded stone wall for balance. Then, halfway down the corridor, you saw it. Another door, plain and unmarked, but slightly ajar. The faintest glow bled through the crack at its base. Not candlelight, not firelight. Something else, blue, soft and strange. Against your better judgment, you pushed it open. The room inside was untouched by time. Dust lay on the floor in a perfect ring around the center, where the glow pulsed faintly from an old wooden table. On the table was a single object, a small mirror framed in iron, cracked down the middle. The light was coming from within the crack itself. You stepped closer, drawn to it, even though your every instinct screamed to leave. As your hand reached toward it, the temperature dropped sharply. Your breath came out in a cloud. And then you heard it. A whisper. Not outside, not behind you, inside the mirror. You froze. The whisper didn't form words at first, just broken sounds like wind threading through a cavern. Then slowly syllables began to take shape. Your name. Not once, but over and over, stretched into a chilling chant that made your spine go stiff. You snatched your hand back and stumbled away, knocking over a stool as you turned. The moment your skin broke away from the mirror's reach, the light faded. The room dimmed, and the cold vanished. You didn't run, but your steps quickened as you left that wing. You didn't stop until you reached the servants' quarters, panting and pale. No one was there. Most of them had gone to sleep already. You sat on your cot, the cracked voice still echoing in your mind. It had said your name, and something else, just before the light went out. a phrase you hadn't heard since you were a child. The ash remembers. You had no idea what it meant, but you couldn't shake it. The next day you returned to your duties like nothing had happened, but the world looked different now. The castle had always been a place of secrets and silence, but now you felt like you were standing in the center of it. The prince looked at you again during the midday meal, not with curiosity this time, with recognition. That evening, one of his men, a quiet figure named Halden, pulled you aside near the kitchen passage. He didn't threaten you, didn't question you. He simply handed you a folded piece of cloth and said, "When the bell rings 3 times tonight, bring this to the stables, alone." Then he walked away, not waiting for your answer. Inside the cloth was a key, old, rusted, with a twisted handle shaped like a tree branch. You stared at it long after he had gone. That night, you didn't sleep. You waited, fully dressed, watching the small window above your bed. When the 3rd bell finally rang, slow, hollow, drawn out, you slipped out quietly and made your way to the stables. It was nearly silent except for the restless shifting of horses. One stall near the back was open. You stepped inside and found Halden waiting. He didn't speak, just pointed to the back wall. Behind the straw and tools was a narrow door you'd never seen before. The key fit perfectly. It opened with a heavy groan, revealing a tight stone stairwell that led downward into darkness. Halden held out a small lantern and nodded. "You're not who you think you are," he said quietly, "and it's time you remembered." He didn't follow you down. The stairs seemed to go forever. The deeper you walked, the more the walls seemed to close in. The air turned thick, musty, filled with the scent of damp stone and old iron. Finally, the stair opened into a wide chamber, a circular room carved from stone, with strange markings etched into every surface. At its center was a raised platform, and on it, another mirror, larger than the one in the western wing, not cracked but fogged over from within. As you approached, the fog shifted, then cleared, and there you saw yourself, but younger, and not in servant's clothes, dressed in fine velvet, standing beside the prince, though not today's prince. A boy, maybe 8 years old. Your hand rested on his shoulder. You were laughing, smiling. A noble, a caretaker, a protector. You didn't sleep after leaving the hidden chamber. You barely made it back to your cot before sunrise, and even as the first hints of light reached through the high castle windows, your mind was still caught somewhere far below, deep in the dark, stone-walled room where the mirror had revealed what you could hardly believe. The image haunted you, yourself in noble garb, with the young prince beside you. The memory felt impossible, like something imagined. But it hadn't been a dream. The stairs were real. The mirror was real. And that voice, whispering it's time, had sounded like it came from inside your own bones. You had been raised in the castle kitchens, fed scraps, scrubbed soot, and slept on a straw mat for as long as you could remember. And yet the mirror had shown another truth entirely, one that clashed with the life you'd always accepted. The next morning everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. The walls, the halls, even the people, all of it felt like a stage you were waking up on halfway through a play. The other servants went about their work as usual. The steward barked his orders. The castle cat prowled the stairwell, but every glance, every sound, every step now held a question behind it. Who were you really? Why had the castle kept this secret? And more urgently, who else knew? You couldn't ignore the way the prince had looked at you yesterday, nor how Halden had spoken to you in the stables like a man speaking to someone far more important than a servant. And yet no one had stopped you. No one had accused you of trespassing in the forbidden wing or demanded an explanation. It was as though those who knew were simply waiting for you to catch up to something they already understood. As the day wore on, you noticed a shift. Small things. A knight you didn't know gave you a respectful nod when you passed him near the armory. A maid, who normally avoided eye contact, offered you a small loaf of bread at midday, something that never happened. In the courtyard, a page handed you a rolled parchment without a word, then quickly disappeared down a corridor. You unrolled it carefully. It was a map of the castle, one far older than any you had seen in the steward-ass office. It marked not just rooms and wings, but hidden staircases, sealed doors, and something called the throne below. The ink was faded but legible, the corners soft with age. Someone had gone through great effort to preserve it. That night, you couldn't resist. You waited until the bells tolled again and returned to the mirror chamber beneath the stables. The air seemed even colder this time. The mirror still stood, but its surface had clouded again. You stepped closer, half expecting it to remain still, but it stirred. Slowly the glass cleared, revealing another scene. Not of you this time, but of two men. One was the king, much younger, standing before a council table. The other, your breath caught, was your father. Or rather, the man you now remembered in glimpses. Not a servant, a noble, one of the king's advisers. You watched silently as the image played out. Your father argued for peace. The king demanded war. Your father warned of bloodshed. The king turned his back, and then a flash. Soldiers entered the room. Your father was arrested. The mirror flickered. Your father disappeared. And then your infant self handed to a wet nurse, then smuggled through a servant's tunnel. A whisper reached your ears again. To protect you, we made you forget. You staggered back from the mirror, hands trembling. The truth settled into you like ice. You weren't born a servant. You were made one, hidden among the kitchen hands to survive. Your father had opposed the war that ultimately brought ruin to the southern provinces. His refusal had been seen as treason, and you had been the last remaining piece of him, a risk to the throne. You left the chamber quietly, your thoughts louder than your footsteps. You understood now why the western wing was sealed, why the castle avoided your gaze, why the prince's guard had approached you not with suspicion, but with reverence. This castle had buried your past under years of soot and scrubbing, but it could not erase blood. And now the very stones seemed to remember. The next morning Halden approached you again, this time in the outer courtyard, while others bustled about with barrels and grain. You saw it, he said without question. The truth. You understand now. You nodded, words caught in your throat. He handed you a ring, plain, iron, old, etched with a small emblem, a tree with roots wrapped around a sword. Your father's seal, Halden said. There are still those who remember, who kept it safe. You turned the ring over in your hand. It felt strange and heavy, like holding a name long forgotten. There are choices ahead, Halden continued, voice low. The prince isn't like his father. He doesn't crave blood or power, but others at court do. When they learn who you are, they won't be pleased. The question now is simple. Will you keep hiding, or will you claim what's yours? You didn't answer right away. The castle loomed behind you, its towers and walls as familiar now as they were foreign. You looked toward the western wing, toward the sealed halls and the mirror's memory. For the first time in your life, you didn't feel like a servant pretending to belong. You felt like someone waking up from a very long dream. The days that followed moved slowly, but your thoughts did not. You carried the weight of knowledge now, truth heavy in your chest like a stone in still water. Everything around you had changed, even if no one dared speak of it aloud. You were still scrubbing floors and fetching firewood, but there was something different in the way others looked at you. Halden continued his quiet watch, always near enough to step in if danger came, yet distant enough to avoid suspicion. You had grown used to hiding, but now you understood it was only ever meant to be temporary. Every task, every corner of the castle that once felt routine now shimmered with layered meaning. These were the halls your father had walked, not just as a servant, but as an advisor to the king. These walls had held secrets for too long. One evening, just after dusk, you found yourself in the east corridor, the one that overlooked the inner garden. No one came here often. The nobles preferred the western sun, and the servants kept to the lower wings. It was here that the prince found you. No guards, no warning, just soft footsteps behind you, and then his voice. You remember, don't you? You turned slowly. His eyes weren't accusing. They weren't afraid either. There was a strange calm in him, as if he too had been waiting for this moment. You nodded, unsure of what to say. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he walked to the stone balustrade and looked out over the courtyard. "My father feared your bloodline," he said finally. "Said you'd come back for the throne, that you'd rally the old houses against him." "I didn't even know," you replied. "Until a few days ago, I didn't know anything." He glanced at you then, and there was no hostility in his expression, just the deep tiredness of a boy raised in a world of suspicion. "I believe you," he said, "and I don't want war. I don't want the castle to fall again because of old grudges." You stepped beside him, watching the last of the light fade behind the towers. "Then why are you here?" "To ask you to stay hidden," he said softly. "For now. Let the others think you're still just a servant. Let them believe the past is still buried." His request struck you with quiet force. You had spent your entire life unnoticed, unimportant. And now, when the truth had finally surfaced, you were being asked to return to the shadows. But looking into his face, you understood. He wasn't afraid of you. He was afraid of what others might do if they learned. There were still lords in the court who remembered the old days, who'd whispered rebellion for years, waiting for a spark to light the fuse. "I'll stay quiet," you said after a pause. "But I won't stay still. I want to learn. I want to understand everything, who my father really was, what he stood for, what he died trying to protect." The prince nodded once. "Halden will help. I trust him. More than most." From that night forward, a new rhythm formed in your days. By morning you remained a servant, moving through corridors with buckets, sweeping hearths and cleaning chamber pots. But after dark, your true education began. Halden met you in forgotten study rooms and silent corners of the castle where no one came anymore. He taught you how to read ancient records, how to trace lineages, how to recognize the sigils of noble houses long fallen. You pored over maps with hidden borders and read letters exchanged in secret during the war that had taken your father's life. With every page, the man your father had been became clearer, not just a name erased from history, but a thinker, a strategist, a man who had tried to hold peace together with bare hands. Halden also taught you how to move like a noble, how to speak without betraying too much, how to listen more than you talked. "One day," he said, "you'll have to sit at their tables, maybe not as a ruler, but as something more dangerous, a reminder." But it wasn't just learning that filled your nights, it was also danger. You began to notice the shadows growing longer around you. The steward, always fussy, always watchful, seemed more interested in your movements than before. And then there were the strangers. Men in fine clothes who walked the halls late into the evening, speaking in hushed voices, pausing when you passed. One night you overheard two of them whispering behind a tapestry. "The bloodline survived," one said. "The servant girl. We should act before she remembers too much." You told Halden the next day, and he didn't flinch. "They've known longer than we thought," he said. "But they can't move openly, not unless they have proof. That mirror may be the only thing holding them back." That evening, Halden led you to a room you'd never seen before, high up in the castle tower. It was small, round, with a single arrow-slit window, and dust hanging in the air. In the center was a wooden chest, bound in iron. "Your father's journals," Halden said. "I kept them hidden here after he was taken. They're yours now." You knelt before the chest, hands trembling slightly as you opened the lid. Inside were leather-bound volumes, some worn with age, others crisp. You picked up the top one and opened to a page marked with a ribbon. The ink was faded, but neat. "If you are reading this, it means I failed to protect you. But you survived. That means something still can be made right." You read late into the night, tears in your eyes. Every sentence was a window into a man who had loved you, even from the distance of death. And slowly, something hardened in your chest. Not anger, not yet, but resolve. The castle was still playing its games. The court still whispered behind its banners. But you were no longer the girl who cleaned ash from chimneys. You were the child of a man who had dared to speak against kings. And now, at last, your voice was beginning to return. The weeks that followed brought a strange stillness to the castle, the kind that settles before a storm. From the outside, everything seemed ordinary. The bells still rang out each morning, servants moved briskly through the halls, and nobles paced the great chamber draped in their heavy robes and layered ambitions. But beneath the rhythm of routine, there was a quiet tension, invisible to most, but not to you. The silence between footsteps had grown heavier. Words were chosen more carefully. Eyes lingered longer than before. You knew the walls were listening, just as surely as the people within them were watching. And still, you stayed the part. The servant girl, quiet, swift, forgettable. You polished silver and emptied basins. You smiled when spoken to, bowed when necessary, and blended into the scenery as if born to it. But each night the mask came off, and the truth stepped forward. By candlelight you read your father's journals. They were more than just recollections. They were warnings, puzzles, sometimes even riddles woven between lines of council notes and political observations. He had been more than a strategist. He had been a man who understood that peace wasn't something declared, it was something negotiated in shadows, bartered with trust, and defended with knowledge. His writings revealed the fault lines beneath the kingdom's surface, noble houses that still held ancient grudges, alliances built on vanity, deals made in desperation during the old war that were now being broken in silence. You studied each page like your life depended on it, because it did. Halden continued to guide you, though with more urgency now. He no longer tiptoed around hard truths. "They know who you are," he said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "They don't have proof yet, but it won't matter soon. If the court begins to fracture again, you'll be caught in the middle, used or destroyed." You nodded. You had accepted that truth long ago, but acceptance didn't mean inaction. So you began planning, listening, memorizing the rhythms of court gatherings, the timing of when messengers arrived and left, the names of knights whose loyalty could be bought with gold or honor. You knew you weren't ready to confront anyone openly, not yet, but you would be. And when that time came, you wouldn't stand alone. It was during this fragile balance of preparation and caution that an announcement came that rippled through the castle like a stone dropped in still water, a masquerade ball. A grand evening to celebrate the anniversary of the prince's naming, an event meant to unite the noble houses, show the strength of the court, and, you suspected, serve as a distraction from the rot beneath the surface. But to you it meant something more, an opportunity, an evening where identities were hidden, masks worn, and roles blurred. You could move through the halls not as a servant, but as someone else entirely. Halden frowned at the idea. "Too dangerous," he said. "You'll be exposed. Someone will recognize you. You're not ready." But you were tired of waiting. "If I hide forever, they win," you said. "Let them look me in the eyes and not know who I am. That's the power I need now." He didn't argue again, but he didn't help you either. You prepared alone, stealing hours to sew your own costume from old fabric and borrowed lace. Nothing grand, just enough to blend in. You found a plain mask, painted it yourself, and kept your hair tucked beneath a soft velvet hood. When the night arrived, you entered the hall not as a girl who swept ash from floors, but as someone no one could place, a shadow with eyes wide open. The ballroom was alight with fire and laughter. Music filled the air and candles danced across polished floors. Nobles swirled past in silks and feathers, laughter echoing off marble pillars. The prince stood at the head of the room, unmasked but unreadable, greeting his guests with the careful warmth of a man who trusted no one. You watched him, wondering how much he knew, wondering if he could tell you were there among them, hidden in plain sight. You moved carefully through the crowd, your steps deliberate, your eyes alert. Snippets of conversation drifted to your ears, casual tones laced with hidden meanings. "She's still in the castle, I'm sure of it. The steward's been asking too many questions lately. If the old bloodline rises again, we'll be forced to choose sides." You felt the pull of their words, the way secrets clung to them like perfume. You didn't speak much, just enough to stay unnoticed, but in every whispered remark, you gathered more pieces of the puzzle. There were factions within the court, some loyal to the crown, others to old banners long thought destroyed. and in the middle of it all was you, silent, listening, learning. Near the end of the night, you slipped away from the ballroom, heart racing as you ascended the spiral stairs to the library's upper balcony. Few ventured here during celebrations. The air was cooler, quieter. From there you could watch everything unfold below, masked and unseen. But you weren't alone. A voice, soft but clear, broke the silence. You walk like a noble, but your hands are too steady, and you watch like a hawk, not a guest. You turned slowly. A man in a silver mask stood a few feet away, his cloak plain but fine. You didn't recognize him, not fully, but there was something familiar in the way he tilted his head. "I'm just curious," you said carefully. He smiled beneath the mask. "So am I, and I make it a habit to know every player in the court. But I don't know you. That makes you dangerous." You held your ground. Or irrelevant. He stepped closer, his gaze sharp. No one irrelevant walks alone into the heart of a castle filled with enemies, not without purpose. For a moment, neither of you spoke. The music below swelled. Then he turned and walked away, leaving only a few words behind. "Be careful what truths you chase. Sometimes they chase back." You didn't sleep that night. But by dawn, you knew something had changed. The game had begun in earnest, and you were no longer a piece on the board. You were learning how to play. The castle walls, once filled with whispers of admiration and reverence for the queen, now trembled under murmurs of betrayal. You had seen the change coming slowly, like a cold fog creeping in through the cracks in stone, first with sidelong glances, then with silence in the halls where music once played. The queen, once adorned in silk and crowned with the kind of grace only time could bestow, had lost favor not with the people, but with the king himself. It was subtle at first, a missed glance, a short word, a longer absence. But now it hung in the air like a mildew that clung to the tapestries, thick and sour. You kept your head bowed as you moved through the west wing, carrying folded linens for chambers that had not been used in weeks. Word had spread that the king had not slept beside the queen in months. The reasons, as always, were shadowed in rumor. A letter discovered, a misplaced loyalty, a disagreement behind closed doors. You, of course, did not dare ask, but there was one thing you knew for certain. The queen no longer sang. It used to be that her voice would drift through the corridors in the late afternoon, light and calm as if the wind itself carried her melody. You remembered the way it would lift your spirit, even when your hands were raw from scrubbing the courtyard stones. That melody had vanished. Now she only walked in silence, her head held high but her eyes tired, searching the air as though trying to remember something she once had. One evening you were tasked with bringing a tray of dried herbs and warm water to her private quarters. It was a quiet job, one often passed on to someone less tired. But tonight, the castle felt different. There was a stillness, not the kind that soothed, but the kind that warned, the kind that told you something had ended and something else was beginning. As you climbed the stairs, tray in hand, you rehearsed your words, a gentle "Your Majesty," followed by a respectful bow. You had done this before, but when you knocked and entered, what you found shook you. The queen stood at the open window, her long braid unpinned and tumbling over her shoulder, her fingers wrapped tightly around a ribbon of deep crimson. It was not the elegance that struck you, it was the stillness in her face. She turned slowly when she heard you enter, and for the first time, her eyes met yours with no distance, no veil of royalty, just a quiet, exhausted woman. "Do you believe in loyalty?" she asked softly, not as a queen, but as someone starved for truth. You didn't know what to say, so you bowed your head, placing the tray gently on the wooden table. "I have never asked for anything more than what was mine to give," she continued, "yet even that, it seems, has been taken." There was a long pause. You remained still, not sure if you should speak or excuse yourself. The queen sighed, brushing a hand across her forehead. "You needn't answer. It is not your burden." She walked to the table and touched the rim of the wooden cup as though it were a relic. "There are wars fought with swords," she said, "and then there are wars fought in silence, with withheld glances, with absences." She thanked you with a nod, and you left the room with a strange weight in your chest. That night the castle was quiet again, but it was no longer peaceful. It was the quiet of something unraveling. Days passed, and the queen was no longer seen in the great hall. She did not attend the evening suppers nor the council gatherings. Some claimed she had taken ill, others that she had chosen to remove herself from court affairs. The servants spoke less of her now, not out of disinterest, but fear. The king's new attention was drawn elsewhere, to a noble woman who had arrived recently, young and radiant, often seen at his side. Her laughter echoed where the queen's song once did. You couldn't help but notice the way things changed. The food served at meals was simpler. The music, once soft and elegant, became louder, brighter, more full of cheer, as if trying to erase what had been. You continued your tasks, watching from the corners of rooms, holding your tongue, absorbing everything like a sponge that never dared overflow. And then, one morning, the queen was gone. No announcement was made, no ceremony held. Her chambers were quietly emptied, her belongings packed away in plain wooden crates. It was said she had chosen to return to her family estate beyond the southern borders. Others whispered she had been sent there. You would never know which story held the truth. All that remained was the scent of dried lavender in the room she once called her own. Life in the castle moved on. The king smiled more. The noblewoman became more prominent. The halls filled with a different kind of laughter, louder but less sincere. And yet, in the quiet moments, you still remembered the queen's voice, not her orders, not her appearances at court, but the soft songs she sang when no one was meant to listen. There were days you would walk past her former chambers and stop just outside the door, remembering the weight of the tray in your hands, the sound of her voice asking you about loyalty. You never answered her question. Perhaps you couldn't. Perhaps no one could. But deep in your heart, as the seasons changed and the castle continued to evolve, you carried that moment with you. A woman wronged not with swords or betrayal in the open, but with absence, with silence, with the slow erasure of her place in a world that had once called her queen. The rain fell hard against the castle that morning, turning the courtyard's dirt paths into dark ribbons of mud. You rose early, as always, the chill of the stone floor biting into your bare feet, before you'd even tied your linen apron around your waist. The fire in the servants' quarters hadn't been lit yet, and everyone moved slower, clinging to warmth through shawls and silent prayers. Your task today was in the oldest part of the castle, the North Tower, long unused except for storing barrels, broken furniture, and crates of forgotten things. No one liked being assigned to the North Tower. It was too far from the kitchen, too cold, and far too quiet. But you had never minded the quiet. In truth, it gave you space to think. The North Tower held stories of its own. Some of the older maids said it had once been the living quarters of a bastard prince, hidden away in shame. Others swore a monk had gone mad in the stone rooms, scribbling secrets on parchment that was later burned. You never put much stock in gossip, but still, a strange feeling always crept over you when you climbed the winding stair, hand gliding along the wall's edge for balance. The dust up there smelled of old parchment and stone. You were sent with orders to clear out a cluster of broken casks and sweep the far corner. It was to be prepared, someone said, though no one explained for what. The room, windowless and circular, had a domed ceiling stained by years of smoke and time. The hearth had not been used in decades, and the shelves were crooked with age. You lit a small oil lamp and began moving things, lifting rotted burlap sacks and brushing aside cobwebs that clung like lace. In the far corner, where the stone met the wooden beams of the floor, your broom caught on something. Not a rock, not a nail, something oddly shaped. You crouched down and brushed the area with your fingers, your breath catching slightly in the cold air. There, beneath layers of dirt, was a thin wooden panel set into the floor. It didn't match the others. You tapped it gently. Hollow. Not just that, loose. Your fingers worked carefully, prying it up inch by inch. Underneath, there was darkness. Then something soft and dry. Wrapped in a brittle cloth, hidden away where no one would think to look, was a bundle no bigger than your forearm. You hesitated before unwrapping it. Part of you wanted to return it untouched, report it to the steward, forget you'd ever seen it. But curiosity had already taken hold, and your fingers moved before your thoughts caught up. Inside the cloth were parchments, thin, fragile sheets of vellum, each covered in handwritten lines so delicate they looked like spider threads. The ink had faded, but you could still make out words in Latin, French, and a few symbols you couldn't place at all. Some were letters, some might have been spells, maps, descriptions of people, notes about the royal family. One page mentioned a chamber beneath the Eastern Chapel, another listed names long forgotten, with strange symbols beside each. You knew right away that this was not meant for any ordinary eyes, perhaps not even the king's. The hair on the back of your neck stood upright. What you held felt older than the tower itself. This wasn't just hidden, it had been buried with intention. And you, just a servant, just someone who swept floors and carried trays, you were not supposed to see it. You quickly wrapped the bundle back up, your hands trembling. But as you tried to place the panel back into the floor, a loud creak echoed from the stairwell. You froze. Someone else was in the tower. You blew out your lamp, heart pounding in your chest, and crouched low in the shadows. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, making their way up the stairs. You could make out the faint flicker of another light, probably another lamp, casting long shadows on the wall. You held your breath. For a moment you imagined it might just be another servant, but the steps were too slow for that, too sure. This person knew where they were going. You slid the bundle beneath your apron and stepped back into the gloom, heart racing. The figure stopped just outside the doorway, as though listening. Then slowly, the light faded. Whoever it was had decided to leave. You didn't stay long after that. You tucked the bundle behind a loose stone in the chimney, promising yourself you'd return for it when it was safe. Then you made your way back to the servants' stair, saying nothing, looking no one in the eye. The rest of the day passed in a blur. You kept your head down, but your thoughts swirled like leaves in wind. Who had hidden those pages? And more importantly, why? You couldn't shake the feeling that something big was beneath the surface of the castle, something deeper than politics or love affairs or royal drama. Perhaps it was magic. Perhaps it was treason. Perhaps it was both. But in that moment, as the rain poured down and the fires crackled in the great hall below, you realized one simple truth. This castle, with all its secrets and power, was far more dangerous than it seemed. And now you carried one of those secrets with you. The castle grounds had many secrets, but few were as quietly whispered about as the Lady of the Lantern Tower. You had heard stories in the scullery as a child, huddled close to the kitchen hearth on stormy nights. They said she wandered the winding staircases of the tall north tower, a pale lantern always in hand, her figure just visible through the high windows when the moonlight was kind. Most said she was a ghost, the spirit of a noblewoman who had once been imprisoned in the tower by her own family. Others believed she was still alive, hidden away, kept like a forgotten page in a closed book. You never knew what to believe until the night you saw her for yourself. It began on a fog-heavy evening when most of the household was either asleep or tucked away near the warmth of the main halls. You had stayed behind in the upper corridors to sweep and air out the tapestries that clung to the stone walls like old memories. The corridors in the tower wing were always colder, the kind of cold that clung to your bones no matter how thick your apron or sleeves. You moved from one window to the next, opening narrow slits to let the stale air out. That's when you saw her. A dim, flickering glow, like the flame of a candle, bobbed gently behind a pane of glass near the very top of the tower. You paused, broom in hand, squinting through the mist that curled around the castle's corners. The light didn't behave like a reflection or the moon. It moved deliberately, rising and lowering as though carried by someone pacing. Curiosity tugged at you, and though you knew you'd be scolded for wandering, your feet began to move of their own accord. You ascended the stairs, slowly, the spiral turning tighter with each level, the stone steps worn smooth by years of quiet footsteps. The higher you climbed, the more silent the air became, as though the very stones were holding their breath. At last you reached the old wooden door that marked the lantern level. It was half ajar. You had never noticed it open before. The air that seeped from the crack was musty, heavy with the scent of dried herbs and dust, but beneath it was a faint sweetness. Lavender, perhaps. You pushed gently, and the door creaked open. Inside the room was dim, lit only by a small flame enclosed in a rusted lantern, hanging from a hook in the ceiling, and beneath it stood a woman. She was tall, thin, and wrapped in layers of faded fabric that had once been fine silk. Her hair, once perhaps golden, was now silver-white and hung in long, straight lines down her back. She didn't look at you. Instead, she was gazing out the narrow window slit at the mist-covered courtyard below. You didn't speak. You weren't even sure if you were supposed to be there or if she even knew you had entered. But after a long moment she spoke, softly, as if not to startle you. "You see it too, don't you? The way the fog turns the castle into a floating island, as though the rest of the world has vanished." Her voice was clear, not like a ghost's at all. It was tired, yes, but it had a richness, the kind of tone born from years of reading aloud in lonely rooms. You nodded slowly, unsure what else to do. She turned then, just slightly, and you caught the curve of her cheek, the way her eyes were sharp and bright, not dull like you had expected. She didn't ask your name, nor did she give hers. But over the next few days you returned, always careful, always quiet. She never left the tower, and she never spoke of her past. You brought her bits of food and water, not because she asked, but because it felt wrong not to. She accepted them with quiet grace, always thanking you with a slight nod. Sometimes she would speak of the sky, of books, of old gardens that no longer existed. Other times she simply sat near the lantern, watching the flame as though it held every memory she had ever known. Eventually you pieced together the edges of her story. She had been the sister of a nobleman once engaged to marry a lord far away. But war had broken out, alliances had shifted, and she had become a problem. A threat to inheritance, to political marriages, to power. And so rather than let her go, they locked her away. Not in a dungeon, no, but in the tower, where she could be forgotten quietly. Servants changed over the years, and eventually only a few knew of her presence. And then, fewer still. Until perhaps you were the only one left who truly saw her. She had long stopped waiting for rescue, she once told you. Hope was not something she carried anymore, but she seemed content in her own strange way to watch the world change from above. "They say the view from here is cursed," she said one evening, as the lantern's flame danced low. "But I think it's simply honest. Up here, you can see the storm coming long before anyone below even notices the wind." You wanted to help her, of course. But how? No one would believe you. No one would risk their position to challenge the Lorda's bloodlines or open up long-buried family shames. So you kept her secret, hidden in your heart like a pressed flower. You continued to visit when you could, to bring her what little you had, to sit in silence beside her while the lantern glowed. And one day, she was gone. The room was empty, the lantern still burning, the air still warm. No sign of a struggle, no scent of decay. Just a folded piece of parchment with no writing on it, left on the ledge of the window. You stood there for a long time, not knowing what to make of it. And then, gently, you closed the door and walked back down the stairs. The lady of the lantern tower was never seen again. But sometimes late at night, when the fog rolls thick across the courtyard, you think you see a light flickering high above. And for just a moment, you feel the warmth of her presence again, watching, remembering, existing somewhere beyond time. The year the snows refused to melt is remembered by the castle folk in quiet shivers and distant eyes. It began with an early frost, nothing out of the ordinary for autumn Susclose, but by the time the leaves should have returned to the trees, the world remained pale and heavy, draped in a constant shroud of gray. The ground hardened, the rivers froze solid, and the sky turned into a wide, still sheet of cold silence. No birds returned, no green shoots pierced the white. It was a winter that curled itself around every stone and timber of the castle and never let go. You remember waking to the sound of silence, not the peaceful kind, but the sort that settles in your chest like a weight. The fires had burned low, the coals barely glowing. You wrapped yourself tighter in the scratchy wool blanket you'd sewn from scraps and crept toward the hearth, hoping to coax a little warmth from the embers. Your breath curled visibly in the air. Even indoors it was too cold to speak. The castle had always been drafty, with long hallways and high ceilings that swallowed heat no matter how many braziers were lit. But this winter was different. No matter how many layers you wore or how many furs the steward distributed, it felt like the cold was inside you. The lords and ladies complained at first, but after a while they simply stopped speaking about it, as though naming the cold gave it more power. Even the hounds in the kennel began to howl less and curl into themselves more. Food stores, meant to last until spring, began to dwindle faster than expected. The root cellar was carefully inventoried, and the steward locked it with an iron key he wore around his neck. No one dared steal, not out of honor, but out of fear of exile into the snow-covered woods, which had taken on a haunted quality. People whispered of shapes in the distance, of shadows too large to be wolves, of cries that didn't quite sound human. The forest had gone quiet, and when nature falls silent, it feels as though something is listening. You were assigned to the great hall, tending to the fireplace and helping with meals, when there were enough scraps to justify calling them that. The hall, once a place of laughter and song, had become a long, echoing chamber of clinking bowls and hollow stairs. The nobles sat in their furs, hands wrapped around steaming cups of broth, as if the heat might chase away the fear curling in the corners of their eyes. Servants moved more slowly, not out of laziness, but from exhaustion. The cold made every movement an effort. You remember one day in particular when you were sent to the tower storeroom to fetch a sack of barley. The staircase was steep and narrow, and ice had crept in through the mortar, making each step slick with danger. You moved carefully, clutching the wall, your breath short from the thin, frozen air. At the top you found the door stuck fast with frost. You had to brace your shoulder against it, teeth gritted, pushing with everything you had until it groaned open. Inside, the floor was covered in a fine dusting of snow that had crept in through unseen cracks. The sacks lay stacked like sleeping bodies, a quiet reminder of how little remained. While you filled your basket, you noticed something strange. A small pile of feathers, black and glossy, half buried in snow near the window. You brushed them aside, only to find the frozen body of a raven, its eyes closed as if in sleep. It hadn't been dead long, and yet, how had it gotten in? The windows were shuttered tight, the room locked. You backed away slowly, the feeling of being watched crawling along your spine. Later that night, by the firelight, you told the old washerwoman what you'd seen. She looked at you over her mended mittens and said in a low voice, "The birds know. When the world tips too far, they're the first to leave, or the last to warn." You didn't ask what she meant. Some things are better left half understood. As days turned to weeks, the cold pressed harder. The castle well froze solid. Snow drifted so high against the outer doors that it took hours to dig paths for even the smallest deliveries from the nearby village, and then even those ceased. Rumors spread that the roads had disappeared beneath avalanches and that the villagers were burning their homes to stay alive. One boy, barely older than you, tried to flee the castle in search of his family. He made it as far as the old orchard before turning back, frostbitten and half-blind, whispering that something in the trees had followed him, step for step, though he'd seen no one. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the snow stopped. The wind quieted. One morning you awoke to a strange light peeking beneath the door. Not firelight, but something clearer. You hurried to the nearest window, rubbing frost from the glass with your sleeve. And there it was, sunlight. Thin, yes, and still low in the sky, but golden and warm and real. The snow sparkled, no longer heavy and grey, but light and shining. People stumbled from their rooms, blinking into the brightness like cave-dwellers, seeing the world anew. Some wept openly, others simply stood, speechless. But the warmth did not return all at once. The thaw came slowly, cautiously, as though nature itself had learned to distrust the castle. It would take many more weeks for the rivers to run again, and the trees to bud. But it came. Eventually it came. Years later, when you spoke of that winter to younger servants who hadn't yet been born, they looked at you with wide eyes and laughter on their lips. "A whole year of snow?" they would say. "No birds at all? Surely you're teasing us." But you would simply smile and shake your head. You knew what it had been like to watch the sun disappear, to wonder if spring had been nothing more than a dream, to fear that even time itself had frozen. And sometimes when winter returns each year, and the castle is cloaked once more in silence and white, you still wake at night and peer through the window, not in fear but in memory, half expecting to see that raven again, sitting still in the snow, waiting to whisper a warning. There are some things that happen within castle walls that never make their way into records or royal decrees. They exist in quiet corners, passed in whispers between servants in the laundry cellars, or murmured under breath while sweeping the great hall. Some stories are too small for the scribes and too strange for the nobles. Yet they are remembered, you know, because you lived one. It started with a name you weren't meant to hear. It was late one evening when you were scrubbing the flagstones outside the steward's chamber. You were meant to be elsewhere, but the kitchen had run out of firewood and your usual chores had been rerouted. As you dipped the brush into a bucket of half-frozen water, the steward's door creaked open and 2 men stepped out, their voices low but urgent. You recognized the steward by his worn leather boots and always tight jaw. The other man was unfamiliar. Dressed in a heavy gray cloak with no emblem on his chest, he moved like someone used to shadows. "She knows," the man in gray said. "She's been hiding it." The steward spat into the fire basin beside the door. "Then she'll be dealt with, quietly." The man glanced down the corridor, and for a moment you thought he looked straight at you. You dropped your brush, heart pounding, pretending to fuss over the mess on the floor. When you glanced up again, the men were gone. The door shut behind them with a soft thud. You didn't know who she was, but you knew the tone. You'd heard it before, in the way a butcher speaks of a goat too old to keep, or how the knights muttered before the last hanging. It was the sound of something already decided. You finished your cleaning and returned to the dormitory, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time you closed your eyes, you saw the steward's boot tapping impatiently on the stone. The next few days passed uneventfully on the surface, but in your gut, you could feel something had shifted. The castle was too quiet. People kept their heads lower. Conversations stopped when others entered the room. Even the cats that skulked near the kitchens moved more carefully, as though sensing the tension woven into the air. It wasn't until 4 days later that you discovered the girl. Her name was Edeline. You knew her in passing, mostly because she was small and quick, and always seemed to be carrying linens from one tower to the next. She smiled often, the kind of smile that warmed people even when the fires burned low. But when you found her, there was no smile. She was curled behind the stacked hay in the stable loft, pale as moonlight and shivering despite the blankets she'd wrapped around herself. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. You nearly screamed when she grabbed your wrist. Her fingers were ice cold, but her grip was fierce. "Don't tell," she whispered, eyes wide. "They're looking for me. Please." You hesitated, looking toward the ladder you'd just climbed. It was late, and the stables were empty except for the sleeping horses below. You could lie, you could pretend you hadn't seen her and walk away, but something in her face stopped you. It wasn't just fear, it was something else, something urgent, desperate, and entirely human. Instead, you stayed. You brought her crusts of bread and a half-frozen apple from the kitchen. You brought water when the night watch changed and no one would see you slip across the courtyard. You didn't ask why she was hiding. You knew better than to press. In the castle, questions were as dangerous as swords. But one night, as the frost clung to the beams and your own breath came out in shallow clouds, she told you. "There's a door," she said, her voice nearly too soft to hear. "Behind the chapel altar. I found it when I was cleaning. It leads to a passage. I followed it. There are stairs, deep stairs. At the bottom there's something buried, something ancient." You frowned, unsure what she meant. She pulled a small bundle from beneath the hay, carefully wrapped in linen. Inside was a pendant, unlike any you'd seen. It was old, clearly, made of copper or bronze, but shaped with such detail that it didn't seem to belong to your world. Etched across its surface were markings that looked like runes or letters, but not of any language you knew. At its center was a dull black stone, flat and cold, but when the moonlight hit it just right, it shimmered red like embers. "I think it's cursed," she said, "or holy, or both." You wanted to laugh, but the seriousness in her face made the sound die in your throat. You looked at the pendant, then at her, and for a moment you believed her, because the air around that pendant didn't feel right. It felt still, unmoving, as though time held its breath. "They saw me," she whispered. "I didn't mean for anyone to know, but someone followed me back. That's why they're after me. They think I stole it, but I didn't. It was already there." You didn't know what to say, so you said nothing. You just took the pendant from her shaking hands, wrapped it again, and tucked it beneath your tunic. She disappeared 2 days later. No one said where she'd gone. The steward claimed she'd run off with a merchant. Some servants whispered that she'd been exiled. Others believed she was still in the castle, hidden in the walls like a ghost. You kept the pendant hidden, though you never dared look at it again. Years passed. You became older, stronger. Your chores changed. People forgot about Edeline, but not you. Every time you passed the chapel, you paused just slightly, eyeing the altar with silent curiosity. And some nights, when the castle was too quiet and your dreams too strange, you swore you could hear footsteps in the passage no one else believed in, because in the life of a castle servant, some secrets never sleep, and some truths are best kept buried. Not all falls from grace are sudden. Some, like Sir Arna's, happen in slow, steady crumbles, like old mortar giving way stone by stone until the whole tower leans and collapses in silence. You'd watched him for years, this once revered knight with his polished armor and tales of border skirmishes. As a child servant, you'd admired the way he carried himself in the great hall, how he spoke less than the other knights, but always with weight. But time has a way of wearing down even the proudest figures, and for Sir Arna, the weight of past glories became heavier than any sword. He once stood tall during evening feasts, seated near the Lord's dais, but now he lingered near the kitchen doors, nursing watered-down ale and staring too long into the fire. You first noticed the change in his eyes. They had grown distant, not clouded with age, but as if seeing things that were no longer there. Sometimes, as you brought him his drink or cleared the trenchers, he'd speak as if to someone beside him, an old comrade, perhaps, or a memory too real to forget. "They came at dawn," he once muttered as you passed behind him. "We weren't ready. The trees moved first." You didn't ask. Servants don't ask, but you remembered. Rumors spread, as they always do. Some said he'd lost his mind after a failed campaign beyond the river. Others whispered of a curse he'd brought back with him from the eastern borderlands, a mark left not by blade, but by something darker. He had returned thinner, quieter, no longer seeking the training grounds, but rather the solitude of the old stables or the chapel ruins. He spent long hours sharpening a sword he never used, not out of purpose, but habit, like a man afraid of forgetting who he used to be. One evening you were sent to deliver a message to him. Nothing special, just a request from the steward for his presence at the gatehouse. You found him behind the stables, sitting on a broken barrel beneath a drape of ivy, his sword resting across his knees. He looked at you not with surprise, but as if he'd been expecting someone. "You ever wonder," he said before you could speak, "how many men you must kill before the silence around you changes?" You froze, unsure what to answer. He nodded slowly and stood, joints cracking like brittle wood. "Tell him I'll come," he said, taking the sword and walking past without another word. It was the last time you saw him whole. The next day word spread that Sir Arna had refused to take arms when summoned to lead a scouting party into the northern woods. A noble son was missing, vanished near the old roads, and Sir Arna had been the only knight with knowledge of that terrain. But he'd declined, saying he'd given all he could to war and would give no more. Such defiance from a knight wasn't just rare, it was scandalous. Knights served without question. Honor wasn't optional. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast the castle in bronze and violet shadows, Sir Arn was brought before the Lord's seat. You weren't meant to be in the hall, but you lingered behind the kitchen curtain, peeking through the heavy folds as the court gathered. The Lord's voice was low, controlled, but the anger sat just beneath the surface. "You owe your life to this house," he said, hands clenched on the carved arms of his chair, "and yet you refuse it in its hour of need." Sir Arn didn't bow. He didn't kneel. He stood in the center of the hall, armor half rusted and boots worn, like a statue of a knight from a forgotten age. "I owe my life," he said quietly, "but I will not spill more blood for a boy already dead." Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Even the other knights stepped back, unsure whether they'd just witnessed madness or treason. The Lord rose. "Then you are no longer a knight of this house." The hall held its breath. Sir Arnie only nodded. He placed his sword on the floor with care, as if laying down a child, and turned to leave. No one stopped him. No guards drew weapons, perhaps because they were stunned, perhaps because no one really wanted to be the one to strike the broken man, or maybe because, despite everything, some part of his legend still lingered in the room like smoke. He walked out of the castle gates that night without food, without coin, and without a title. You followed from a distance, unable to stop yourself. He didn't look back. He crossed the drawbridge, took the forest path, and disappeared into the trees. It was said he lived for a while in the old mill cottage near the river. Others claimed he wandered the roads, offering protection to travelers in exchange for stories. But one winter his cloak was found folded near the mouth of a cave where wolves had been denning. No body was recovered, no grave marked. The sword he left behind still rests in the armory, untouched and unrusted, though no one dares claim it. Some say it carries the weight of his shame. Others believe it remembers him still and waits for someone with a soul scarred deep enough to wield it. You never spoke of what you saw that day, but every time you pass the old training yard or hear tales of knights at the evening fire, a shadow flickers in your thoughts. Not all knights fall in battle. Some fall quietly, piece by piece, until the only thing left is the silence they leave behind. The old tower at the edge of the inner ward had always been avoided. Even in daylight, when the sun brightened the stones and the birds flitted from window to window, there was something cold and uneasy about that place. It wasn't haunted in the way children imagined. There were no shrieks in the night, no glowing eyes or rattling chains, but rather, it seemed forgotten by time itself, as though the rest of the castle had moved on and the tower had been left behind. You had passed it countless times, carrying water or sweeping the walkways, and every time you did, you found yourself walking just a little faster, as if something inside was listening. One early morning, before the bells rang, and while the fog still clung to the ground like breath on a window pane, you were sent to clean the storeroom behind the armory. The steward's keys jingled at your side, and as you passed the base of the old tower, the heavy wooden door stood open, not wide, but enough to be noticed. No one had gone in or out for months, perhaps longer. The tower had once served as a lookout in distant wars, and then as a holding cell for nobles during disputes, but now it held only dust and silence. And yet there it was, ajar. At first you told yourself you wouldn't step inside. Curiosity had undone many servants before you. But as you stood there, staring at the cracked stone threshold, you felt something pull at your sense of duty. If the door had been opened without permission, it would fall on your head later, if anything was missing or damaged. Better to check now, quietly, and be certain. So you stepped inside. The air was dry and stale, with a faint hint of old parchment and damp moss. The walls were lined with crumbling arrow slits, and the spiral staircase curved tightly upward, vanishing into the dimness above. You didn't call out. The silence pressed too thickly for that. Instead, you climbed slowly, one hand on the cold stone wall for balance, the other clutching the ring of keys. Each step echoed like a soft drumbeat, and the higher you went, the more it felt as though the tower was swallowing you whole. At the top of the stairs, you reached a wooden door you hadn't known existed. It was different, newer, heavier, reinforced with iron. And unlike the tower's base, this one was locked. You tried the keys, and to your surprise, the third one fit and turned with a reluctant clunk. The door creaked open to reveal a circular chamber lit only by a single slit of light from a window high above. In the center stood a writing desk covered in old scrolls, half-melted candles, and strange objects. Herbs hung to dry, feathers, glass vials, and a bundle of something wrapped in cloth. Your instinct screamed to leave, but you stepped in anyway. The air was warmer here, but not in a comforting way. It was heavy, like the breath of something watching. On the desk a journal lay open, its ink fresh, though no one had entered in weeks. The writing was careful, practiced, and written in the old dialect only the scribes used now. You couldn't read much of it, only fragments. The Lord's mind is splintering, and visions in the fire, names whispered from the stone. As your fingers grazed the pages, you heard the softest thump behind you. Turning sharply, you saw the cloth bundle had shifted. You didn't dare unwrap it fully, but what peeked from the folds appeared to be a fragment of carved bone, etched with symbols you'd only ever seen in chapel mosaics. Something about it felt wrong, not evil exactly, but out of place, like it belonged to another age, another world. You stepped back, heart thudding, and decided you'd seen enough. But as you turned to leave, your eyes caught the wall behind the desk. There, scratched hastily into the stone, were dozens of markings, some like tally lines, others shaped into names, dates, warnings. The most recent one, scrawled larger than the rest, simply read, "He sees more than we know." You locked the room behind you. You didn't report it to the steward. You couldn't explain what you'd seen without sounding mad, and deep down you felt it was safer that the tower remain undisturbed. In the days that followed, your chores took you farther from the old stones, and for a time you almost convinced yourself you'd imagined it all. But something had shifted since that morning. At night, the tower no longer stood quietly in the backdrop of your dreams. Instead, it loomed in the distance, watching, waiting. A week later, word came that the castle's chaplain had vanished. His chambers were left untouched, robes still folded, his old psaltery open to a hymn about judgment and fire. No one found a trace of him, not in the woods, not in the chapel, not on the roads beyond the walls. And the Lord, growing more withdrawn each day, began spending hours locked away in his solar, muttering to himself about roots in the stone and shadows in the blood. Some whispered that something ancient had been stirred, others blamed illness, madness, or the winter rains soaking too deep into the foundations. You said nothing. But each morning, before the sun rose fully, you found yourself looking toward the old tower and wondering what exactly you'd awoken when you stepped through that door. Winter had settled hard across the land, coating the castle roofs in white frost that never quite melted, even at midday. The hearths burned longer, and the servants shuffled through their tasks with extra layers and weary eyes. It was a winter heavier than most, not just with snow, but with silence. A hush had crept through the halls in recent weeks, as though even the stone had begun to hold its breath. The Lord no longer came down to the great hall. His meals were sent up to his chambers, and returned barely touched. The steward, once meticulous and sharp, now paced in distraction, muttering accounts to himself that made little sense. Fewer knights remained. Some had left under the guise of visiting family estates, but others had simply vanished, their horses found wandering near the southern trail. You had served in the castle long enough to sense the change. It wasn't just decay, it was unraveling. Your duties continued as always. You swept the same halls, carried the same jugs, bowed before the same old banners. But now your steps felt measured. The laughter that once lived among the cooks, the guards, the maids, it had vanished like breath on cold glass. You spoke less and listened more, especially to the bells. Faint, small tolls began echoing from the old chapel tower at strange hours, not for funerals, not for prayer, just ringing, as though someone was counting down. One evening, as snow whispered gently against the windows, and the castle sat in an uneasy quiet, you were summoned to the inner chambers by the steward himself. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes too wide. He didn't offer explanation, just handed you a ring of keys and told you to fetch a book from the Lord's private study. "It must be now," he whispered, voice trembling, "before nightfall." You asked no questions. The study was a somber place, filled with scrolls, tall shelves, and thick velvet drapes that blocked most of the cold. You found the book quickle-bound in dark leather, old and brittle. But as your fingers closed around it, a sudden noise made you pause. A sound from within the wall, scratching, like something alive. It stopped as soon as you held your breath, and then came the whisper. Faint, just a name, spoken once, but so close it felt like it had been said beside your ear. You left without looking back. The steward never spoke of the book again. That same night he locked himself in the chapel and was not seen the next day. By the end of the week no one remained to give orders. The kitchen fire died out. The guards were gone from the gates. The bell rang again. Once. You stayed, perhaps because there was nowhere to go, or perhaps because you were afraid of what you might carry with you if you left. You cleaned the halls, you lit candles, you watched snow fall through the gaps in the tower roof. The castle grew quieter with each passing day, until it felt like you were the last thought in a place long forgotten. One morning, after a night of restless dreams faces in the stone, the flicker of fire behind closed doors. You stepped outside the servants' quarters and saw the courtyard completely empty. No footprints, no ash from the fires, just silence and snow. And then the bell rang again, but this time it didn't stop. It rang once, then again, slow, deliberate. You walked toward it, drawn like a moth toward warmth, though there was no warmth to be found. As you neared the chapel tower, you saw a figure at the rope cloaked, unmoving, face hidden. The bell swung with unnatural rhythm, as if it obeyed some purpose known only to itself. You didn't speak. You simply stood and listened. After the seventh toll, the figure turned and vanished into the chapel without a sound. You followed. Inside, the air was warm, not with fire, but with something deeper. Old prayers seemed to hum against the wooden beams. Candles had been lit, though none had touched them. At the altar lay a book you had never seen before, open, blank, waiting. And so you began to write. Not because you knew what to say, but because your hands moved as if remembering. You wrote of the bells of the tower, of the things you'd seen but never dared name. And with each word the air grew calmer, the stone less heavy, as if the castle had only been waiting for someone to remember it, not with fear, but with truth. By nightfall you closed the book and placed it gently beneath the altar. You left the chapel without a sound. The castle was not empty anymore. It breathed again. Not loudly, not with cheer or song, but with the quiet rhythm of a place, finally at peace. You returned to your little chamber near the scullery, folded your hands, and sat beside the dying fire. Snow still fell outside, soft and endless. But inside, for the first time in many years, you felt no fear, only stillness, and as your eyes grew heavy, you knew the castle would remember you, too.